Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is Jacob Tolmachoff, and today I'm going to be covering the prefrontal cortex and the premotor cortex for this video. So let's start off with the prefrontal cortex. All right, so basically the prefrontal cortex, its main purpose is to pass judgment and reasoning towards things. It's the part of the brain that kind of gives reasoning for certain types of things, like I don't know, anything that you're doing. And it also is your planning part of the brain. Whenever you plan something, that's the part of the brain that does it. It is also involved in personality and emotion. All right, so in a case study, Phineas Gage, the subject of one of the science's best known neurological patients, suffered severe damage to the prefrontal cortex following a railroad related accident in 1848. Gage survived, but shown signs of impaired social skills. His case study, which is still controversial today, was a landmark that attributed to specific behaviors, specific brain regions. So basically in this case study, a guy damaged the prefrontal cortex of his brain, and it led to impaired social skills, things like reasoning, judgment, planning, all those things. Now that it was damaged, he didn't really have that part of the brain, so he never really thought of those kind of things. So the associated functions are executive processes, attention, inhibition, intelligence, and social skills. So these are all things that are kind of functions of the prefrontal cortex. Associated cognitive damage. Many cognitive disorders, including ADHD, autism, bipolar disorder, depression, and schizophrenia, have been associated with dysfunctions of the prefrontal cortex. So basically, all of those things are kind of like sub things of the prefrontal cortex, and like obviously there's little different areas in different parts of the brains and stuff and how that affects it and everything, but those certain symptoms also affect the prefrontal cortex. If the prefrontal cortex is damaged, it could cause impairments in initiating voluntary behavior, the inability to inhibit inappropriate social behaviors, and memory dysfunction. So if a frontal lobe is ever damaged, usually it leads to these types of things. Substructures. So these are certain little substructures of the prefrontal cortex. You have the orbital frontal cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Man, these words are really tongue twisters. All right, so I think that covers the prefrontal cortex pretty well. Kind of an overview is it's a judgment part of your brain that passes reasoning, judgment, all that kind of stuff towards things, and if it ever is damaged, then you kind of lose that. So that's basically what this is. So let's move on to the premotor cortex, which is more towards the back of the brain, I guess you could say, maybe more the middle. It's still part of the frontal lobe, so yeah. So an overview of this is the premotor cortex consists of a narrow region between the prefrontal and motor cortexes. It is involved in preparing and executing limb movements and uses information from other cortical regions to select appropriate movements. The premotor cortex is also known for learning, imitation, and social cognitive empathy. So an overview of the premotor cortex is it's basically a part of the brain that executes and moves your limbs, and it kind of gives that information for limb movement and the appropriate timings and all of that kind of stuff. It goes towards your nerve system and all of that stuff. All right, so now in the case study, Schmidt and colleagues found that electrical stimulation of the premotor cortex produced spontaneous smiling and laughter. The authors suggest that the premotor cortex is specifically involved in muscle contractions involved in laughter rather than in processing feelings of mirth or happiness. So basically in this case study, they found that the premotor cortex leads to electrical stimulation in the brain that produces spontaneous smiling and laughter. And this is because the premotor cortex leads to muscle movements throughout your body. So the associated functions: planning and executing motor movements, limitation, and empathy. So I guess another part of the premotor cortex is your empathy for things. And this is another thing that doesn't really say it on here, but I've seen in the past before, where losing a part of your frontal lobe can lead to a loss in empathy for things, and it has to do with the premotor cortex part of the brain. So that's just another thing I kind of want to add on to this. Associated cognitive disorders. The role of the minor neurons in autism is currently a hot topic in neuroscience research. Minor neurons seem to be primarily located in the premotor cortex and inferior partial cortex, associated with damage. So these are basically things that if you damage your premotor cortex, then it might lead to these types of symptoms. All right. So it could lead to impairments in self-initialized movements. So moving your limbs can be either delayed or a little bit wonky. Impaired learning in associating a motor response to a visual cue. Like I said, kind of reaction times is a little bit delayed when you get damage towards your premotor cortex. And cognitive problems, particularly relating to social skills. So your social skills might be a little messed up, just like the prefrontal cortex. As you see, both of these are part of the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe has a lot to do with social skills. So both of these things are a part of that. And I think that covers both of these parts of the brain. All right, guys, thank you for watching this, and I'll see you later. Peace.